about some fun railroad facts? If the water level in a steam locomotive gets below the top of the firebox, they explode. The typical fuel capacity in a modern road locomotive is 5,000 gallons, or $23,400 on average. It's illegal to put salt on the railroad tracks, because it can rust crucial circuitry for things like crossing gates and switch tracks. The first experimental diesel locomotive was made in 1909, though railroads as a whole have primarily used steam longer than they have diesel. Most everyone has heard of a diesel-electric locomotive, but there's also a diesel-hydraulic locomotive. Its wheels are driven via hydraulic motors. The Southern Pacific experimented with them in the 60s. Contrary to popular belief, Rock Island never actually operated on any islands. The B-40-8 is the most powerful 4-axle locomotive ever designed in the U.S., with 1,000 horsepower per axle, making for 4,000 total horsepower. Also, the Dash 8 was the first locomotive to wear GE's Comfort Cab, which is still in use today. Railroad crossings used to be operated by a person sitting in a little shack all day. The last wigwag signal on any Class 1 was on BNSF's Raton sub. Unfortunately, it was removed in 2021. Thankfully, however, it was donated to the Colorado Railway Museum. Speaking of the Raton sub, you can still find operational semaphore signals on there. One time in South Africa, a baboon named Jack operated switch tracks for 9 years. He was paid with beer and caused no wrecks. The famous big boy locomotives could pull 5 miles worth of rail cars. Talk about horsepower. The SD-40-2 was designed to compete with Alcos, and they're still one of the most common locomotives out there. This is the BL-2, probably the ugliest locomotive ever made by EMD. Luckily, it was superseded by the GP7. A railway in Switzerland once experimented with electric steam engines. They would use a heating element to boil water instead of a fire. The only operating railroads in Hawaii are small scenic railroads. They have no freight or passenger service in the entire state. Only 8 big boy locomotives remain today. They're located in St. Louis, Missouri, Frisco, Texas, Omaha, Nebraska, Denver, Colorado, Scranton, Pennsylvania, Green Bay, Wisconsin, and there's 2 in Cheyenne, Wyoming. On the topic of big boys, they were originally going to be called the Wasatch type, until an unnamed employee wrote big boy on the boiler in chalk, and the name stuck ever since. This is a bogey, but I prefer the name I gave it when I was 3, Big Metal. Locomotives are assembled like giant Lego sets, with prefabricated sections that are welded together. The auto start feature on a modern diesel locomotive is to keep the engine coolant from freezing and to keep the diesel from gumming up when it gets cold outside. Union Pacific and Kansas City Southern are the last Class 1 railroads left in the U.S. that haven't been created from the result of a merger. The western-based railroad, Union Pacific, actually started life on the East Coast in Washington, D.C., and was chartered by Abraham Lincoln with the Pacific Railway Act in 1862. There's over 160,000 miles of railroad track in the U.S. There were 90 Class 1 railroads in 1959. Now there's only 7. In Brazil, where narrow gauge is common, you can find locomotives with 4 wheel sets on them. China was still making steam locomotives up until the 1980s. There's SD-40-2s that are older than some steam engines. The Alaska Railroad's Max have a strikingly similar paint job to Burlington Northern's Executive Max. The nickname for Hitler's private armored train was America. There's approximately 60,000 miles of abandoned railroad tracks in the U.S. BNSF is still holding on to a frickin' GP9. It's on a storage track in Galesburg, Illinois. In the very early days of railroading, there were experiments with horse-powered locomotives. They went by crazy names like the Impulsoria, the Flying Dutchman, and the Cycloped. The oldest operating railroad in the U.S. is actually the Strasburg Railroad. It's been operating since 1832. Even though the Santa Fe derived its name from Santa Fe, New Mexico, they didn't even have tracks in the city for their first 17 years of operation. The war bonnet paint scheme was developed all the way back in 1937. The Southern Crescent was the last luxury passenger train to be taken over by Amtrak in the late 70s. The last time cabooses were used on American railroads was in the 1980s. Railroad tracks are welded together with thermite, a chemical that creates liquid iron as a byproduct when it burns. A coin on the tracks ain't enough to derail a train. It's just not possible. The telephone company Sprint stands for Southern Pacific Railway Internal Network Telecommunications. There's no Rock Island Heritage Unit by Union Pacific because they never bought the rights to the name. And there might not ever be a Rock Island Heritage Unit because a little short line in Mississippi known as Rock Island Rail bought the rights to the name a couple years ago. I'm pretty sure there's plenty of other fun facts I've left out, but that's about all I can think of as of now. Maybe there'll be a part 2 sometime. If y'all know any fun railroad facts, leave them in the comments. Thanks for watching. If y'all enjoyed this video, consider checking out some other ones of mine. Till next time.